Come here, family, because this part of the story is important. When many people think about the fight for freedom, they picture marches, protests, and courtrooms. And yes, those battles would come. But before the marches, before the cameras, there were writers. Writers sitting at kitchen tables late at night. Writers working long shifts during the day and then pulling out paper when the world went quiet. Writers who had seen Jim Crow with their own eyes, who had watched families leave the South carrying grief and hope in the same suitcase. They did not all stand on podiums. Some of them stood behind typewriters. In Harlem, these men and women gathered in apartments, cafes, newspaper offices, and literary salons. They debated ideas. They read their poems out loud. They challenged one another to be bold, not just talented, but fearless, because they understood something powerful. If the world could control the story of Black people, then the world could control how Black people were treated. So they decided to write their own story. But let me tell you something else. In Harlem during those days, there was a lot of pressure being a writer. You had to watch what you said because everyone was watching you, reading every word. Some didn't like it. Some thought it defined your whole race. Some said you were too angry. Some said you were too joyful. And the writers knew it wasn't just about your name, not just your family. Your race was counting on you to report what was going on, to teach the world, to uplift, to resist, to not embarrass. Sometimes just writing about anger could be dangerous. Imagine writing about anger and someone saying you were too dangerous. That was Harlem.
Something reflective about writing everyday people.
Since when did they get to decide how we sound?
You know, once this leaves this room, we don't control how it's read.
Mr. Johnson, with respect, if we spend all our time worrying about how they'll read us, we might forget how we sound.
Something about survival and not writing softly forever. I'm not asking you to shrink. I'm asking you to understand the battlefield. When it leaves this room, it doesn't belong to us anymore. How do we resolve this?
That room held more than disagreement. It held the future of Black storytelling. Some believed we must rise carefully. Some believed we must rise honestly. And some believed we must rise at any cost. Now, you know they taught us in school about the man who wrote "The Negro Speaks of Rivers." They made him sound polished, like he arrived fully formed. But they never told you he was born in Joplin, Missouri. Never told you he moved from Missouri to Kansas to Ohio. Never told you his father left for Mexico. Never told you he was raised mostly by his grandmother, a woman who filled his head with stories of Black pride and resistance. Before Harlem knew his name, before anthologies, before applause, Langston Hughes was carrying plates as a busboy in Washington, D.C., working long shifts, listening to powerful men talk about the world. And one night, he slipped poems under a plate. That's the story people like to tell. But the real turning point wasn't fame. It was choice. Because once Harlem embraced him, some folks wanted him refined, elevated, respectable. Instead, he wrote about barbers, about blues, about rent parties, about everyday Black laughter. Some elites worried he was making the race look small. He kept writing anyway, not because he was reckless, but because he believed Black life was already worthy. Now, let me tell you about Zora. Most people come to the city looking to find themselves, but Zora Neale Hurston, she didn't come to Harlem to be made. She arrived whole. See, she grew up in Eatonville, Florida. And honey, Eatonville wasn't just a town, it was a kingdom. Black mayor, Black leadership, Black self-rule. Zora grew up watching her own people run the world before she ever saw a whites-only sign. That does something to a child's spine. It makes it unbendable. So when she stepped onto the pavement in Harlem, she wasn't looking for permission. She was observant, brilliant, and Lord, she was playful. She studied anthropology at Barnard. She knew all the highbrow theories. But when she picked up a pen, she wrote in the voice of the front porch, rhythmic pacing. That grandmother rhythm, that lying session wit, that deep, private, black interior life. In 1937, she gave us her masterpiece. Their eyes were watching God. Now, here's why the critics had an itch they couldn't scratch. The book wasn't centered on white oppression. It was centered on black desire. That was radical, baby. Not because she ignored the struggle, but because she refused to let the struggle be the only story we were allowed to tell. But then, the wind changed. By the 1940s, the protest era moved in. The world wanted anger. They wanted direct confrontation. And Zora, with her dialect, her humor, and her nuance, the elite started to look at her sideways. They said her work lacked urgency. They said she was playing into stereotypes. They turned their backs on the very woman who had spent years traveling the South and the Caribbean, saving our folklore from being erased by time. The publishing checks stopped coming. The friends stopped calling. The woman who once stood in Harlem salons defending our grandmother's soul ended up taking jobs as a maid just to buy groceries. In 1960, the lights went out. Zora died in poverty. She was buried in a grave so poor it didn't even have a name on it. One of the boldest voices of the Renaissance, laid to rest in the dirt without a single stone to mark where the magic went, and the world forgot. Or at least they tried to. But you can't keep a spirit like Zora's in the dark forever. Decades later, a young writer named Alice Walker went into those Florida weeds looking for her. She found that unmarked patch of earth, and she placed a headstone that finally told the truth. Zora paid the price. Not because she lacked brilliance, but because she refused to narrow Black life down to one single, miserable emotion. She stayed true to us, even when we wouldn't stay true to her. And sometimes history punishes people who don't fit the mood of the moment. Now hear McKay's question again. And if we choose wrong, who pays for it? Sometimes it's the one who chose differently. Now let's get one thing straight. Langston Hughes didn't vanish into the shadows the way Zora did. The man stayed in the light. He was published. He was invited to the fancy galas. He was celebrated. But listen to your auntie. Celebration ain't the same thing as protection. See, the very thing that made Langston a giant was the same thing that made the important folks itch. The talented 10th didn't want to see the grit. They wanted to shine. But Langston, he didn't care for pedestals. He wanted to write about the people in the pews and the pool halls. He wrote about the barbers with the sharp razors and the sharper wit. He wrote about the porters carrying luggage that weighed more than their dreams. He wrote about the rent parties where the music was loud enough to drown out the bills. He captured the blues cadence of the way we actually talk when the company leaves the room. And honey, those Black intellectuals, they were terrified. They'd pull him into a corner and whisper, "Langston, you're too gifted to sound so street. You're leaning too close to the low life. What will the world think if they see us like this?" Imagine that. Being told your own mother's tongue is a stereotype. Being told to bleach your soul just to keep the peace. Langston heard them. He understood their fear, but he chose truth over a seat at the table. And yes, baby, it cost him. It cost him favor. It cost him respectability. And Lord, it cost him Zora. Now let me tell you about the break. The textbooks call it a disagreement, but it was a dogfight over a play called Mule Bone. They sat down to write a comedy of Negro life. But the laughs died out when it came to the credits. Zora said the heart of it was hers, based on a story she'd collected in the field. Langston felt he'd put the structure in the bones. It turned into a legal mess. Lawyers, daggers in the mail, accusations. That mule bone snapped a friendship that had survived the worst of the Jim Crow South. They walked away from each other over a play that wouldn't even see a stage for another 60 years. All that genius wasted on a grudge. But Langston, he kept moving. He didn't need the elite's amen. He went to the libraries. He went to the small, dusty halls. He stood in front of the working class folks, the ones with the calloused hands. And when they clapped, that was his oxygen. But don't you miss the fine print. Langston walked a razor's edge. Too radical for the suits, too moderate for the rebels. And later on, the government started taking notes. They followed him, questioned him, put his name on lists because they were scared of his leftist heart. Zora paid in silence. Langston paid in surveillance. Different price tag still cost him his peace. So I'm asking you now, if your art is a battlefield, what does it cost you to pick up your weapon? Now, don't go thinking Claude McKay was some wide-eyed wanderer when he touched down in Harlem. Most people think these artists were discovered, but Claude? He arrived with a secret the American critics weren't ready for. He came from Jamaica, born in 1889, raised in the green hills of Clarendon Parish. He grew up under the heavy thumb of British colonial rule. But here's what the history books skip. He had already mastered the white man's classical poetry, just so he could break it. He was already sharp, already disciplined, already global. When he landed in the States in 1912, he didn't just stay in one lane. He went from Tuskegee to Kansas State. Imagine that shift, baby. From the Caribbean breeze to the dusty American Midwest. Claude saw Black life from every angle, and he realized something about America that would eventually make him one of the most hunted men in the movement. But we'll get to the FBI later. Then came 1919, the Red Summer. Blood in the streets from Chicago to D.C. Black neighborhoods burning. The country was screaming. And Claude? He didn't scream back. He whispered a sonnet that would eventually reach the ears of a world leader in a way no one saw coming. If we must die. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't begging for his life. He was declaring his dignity. And let me tell you how far a Black man's word can travel. That poem crossed oceans. It was quoted in Britain. It was even used by Winston Churchill to rally an entire nation during World War II. Think about that. A Black man's fire used to save the British Empire. That is Harlem shaking the hand of the world. But here's the human part, the part that hurts. Why did a man who reached the heights of global fame die with almost nothing? Claude wasn't just fire and brimstone. He was a soul in search of a home that didn't exist. He had friends in Harlem, but he was always drifting. His politics got radical. He even went to Soviet Russia to see if they had the answers. And that's when the talented 10th turned their backs. W.E.B. Du Bois himself tore into Claude's hit novel, Home to Harlem. Why? Because it was too real. It showed the grit, not the polish. There it is again, the burden. Claude believed in the truth. Du Bois believed in the image. Neither one was a fool, but Claude paid the higher price. As the years rolled on, he grew quiet. He grew isolated. He drifted from the Harlem center that used to feel like lightning. Claude McKay paid in displacement. He paid in a life of movement without ever landing. He paid by never truly belonging to any one camp. Zora paid in obscurity. Langston paid in surveillance. McKay paid in exile. Different choices, different costs, and still, they kept writing. But now we're getting to the heaviest part of this story. Because while Zora, Langston, and Claude paid their price in the town square, there was one man paying his in a mahogany office, James Weldon Johnson. He was the diplomat, the leader, the face of the NAACP. But what happens to a man's spirit when he spends all day looking at photos of lynchings just so he can show them to Congress? You think you know the price of the Renaissance? You haven't seen the bill Johnson had to foot. Now we've talked about the rebels, we've talked about the exiles, but what about the man in the suit? James Weldon Johnson was the golden boy of the Harlem Renaissance. He was the diplomat, the first Black executive secretary of the NAACP. He walked the halls of Congress with a spine made of iron and a voice like velvet. But honey, nobody ever asked what it cost him to stay that polished while the world was on fire. See, while Langston was writing poems and Zora was collecting stories, James was in a mahogany office in New York. On the surface, it looked like power. He was leading the charge for the anti-lynching bill. He was the one trying to force America to look at its own ugly face in the mirror. But here's the part they don't put in the documentaries. To fight the devil, James had to look him in the eye every single day. Imagine his desk. Every morning the mail would arrive, and inside those envelopes, photos. Not family photos, baby. Evidence. Snapshots of our brothers and sisters hanging from poplar trees. Detailed reports of spectacle lynchings, where crowds brought picnics to watch a human being burn. James had to study those photos. He had to categorize the cruelty. He had to count the wounds so he could present the data to white politicians who didn't even want to shake his hand. Can you imagine the toll? Before we leave Harlem, I need you to remember something. Yes, this story held pain, but it also held music. Because while James Weldon Johnson was carrying folders through those halls, he was also carrying a song. A song he wrote years earlier with his brother. One that wasn't born in a boardroom or a courtroom, but in a schoolyard. Lift every voice and sing. It wasn't written to be famous. It was written so Black children could stand taller when they sang it. And somehow, that song kept finding us. In churches, in classrooms, at graduations, at funerals, at moments when we needed to remember who we were. That's what these writers did. They didn't just write protest, they wrote us. Langston was laughing in barbershops and riding the subway with working folks, scribbling lines on scraps of paper. Zora was dancing through Harlem nightlife, listening more than she spoke, catching stories before they disappeared. Claude argued politics over chessboards and cafe tables, thinking bigger than one country ever could. 𝐾𝐿 wrestled with beauty and faith. James balanced rage with restraint. They went to rent parties. They fell in love. They broke hearts. And sometimes broke friendships. Some married, some didn't. Some had children. Some poured everything into the work. And for a moment, Harlem felt like possibility. Painters, musicians, writers, dancers, all in each other's apartments, jazz bleeding into poetry, poetry shaping politics, until life pulled them apart. But listen, years later, when a tired Black woman refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, when young people locked arms and sang to steady their nerves, when a preacher from Atlanta spoke about a dream, they were still singing James's song. They were still walking in Langston's words, still standing in Zora's truth, still carrying Claude's fire. So no, the Renaissance didn't fix everything, but it gave us language, it gave us rhythm, it gave us something to stand on when the world tried to push us down. And next time, we'll talk about the music that carried it even further, because while the writers were writing, the musicians were listening. And baby, they were about to change everything.
Now, before you go, if this story sat heavy on your heart, do your auntie a favor. Click that like button and subscribe to this channel.